evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri. Tonight, Egypt and Hamas both stopping innocent civilians from fleeing Gaza ahead of a ground invasion. Plus, the Greens today showing their inhumanity by condemning not Hamas, but Israel for war crimes. And a pro-Palestinian rally that's been praised in Sydney when it was in fact full of blatant anti-Semitism. Tonight, I'm going to cross live to Israel to get the latest on the ground with the Australian's Yoni Bashan. Also tonight, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison joins me in an exclusive live interview to discuss the Voice referendum's defeat on Saturday and Israel. That's coming up later in the show. Plus, former commando Heston Russell wins his defamation case against the ABC. It is a crushing loss for the public broadcaster. The blame game, fallout, repercussions and accusations are now in full swing in the wake of the Voice referendum's thumping defeat on Saturday. Australians overwhelmingly rejected the Voice, with 60% nationally voting no. The size of the defeat, that definitive and brutal result, shows that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is utterly out of touch with the country he leads. Every single state and territory voted no, all except for the ACT, and they call it the Canberra bubble for a reason. And it's why the politicians and bureaucrats who set the laws for our country so often get it wrong. When you look at the figures, the no vote in Queensland was the highest at 68%, South Australia at 64%, and WA 63% voting no. Now, we knew this overall result was coming for months and months now, but Albanese refused to change direction, change the model, or go back to the drawing board to find a consensus position. And this refusal means that Indigenous Australians today would have every right to feel angry with Albanese. The Indigenous leadership has been working on the concept of a voice for some 15 years. 15 years. And yet Albanese trashed their vision and their hard work in a matter of months. There won't be a voice now. It's done and dusted. It's left many Indigenous families devastated and broken, parents struggling to explain to their children why Australia voted no. They feel that Australia doesn't support them. But that's not the case. Australians care deeply about closing the gap and about the disadvantage that means Indigenous babies born today have a lower life expectancy and lower quality of life than their non-Indigenous counterparts. The fact that many feel deeply sad is entirely on Albanese. He can't blame anyone but himself for choosing a model that didn't have bipartisan support. He knew he needed bipartisan support for the referendum to succeed, and he said this very clearly on Saturday night.
Nor could I guarantee the referendum would succeed. History told us that only 8 out of 44 had done so. But the truth is that no referendum has succeeded without bipartisan support in this country. None.
But Albanese forged ahead with this divisive model that didn't have bipartisan support because he believed it would succeed and he didn't want to share the glory. Indigenous recognition and the Voice was meant to be his legacy as Prime Minister, just like the apology was for Kevin Rudd and same-sex marriages for Malcolm Turnbull. It's a point that journalists Jeff Chambers and Paige Taylor make in their inside story in the Australian newspaper today, and Jeff will be on my show shortly. They write that, and I quote, "Immersed in self-belief, Albanese held a burning ambition to emulate Labor heroes Gough Whitlam, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. He regularly spoke of Wick, Mabo, native title, the Redfern speech, Vincent Lingiari and the 1967 referendum. His confidence was unflappable. He was a history maker who would become the first Prime Minister to win a referendum without bipartisan support." And so it was that Albanese pressed ahead with a model that even many Voice supporters like Greg Craven and Father Frank Brennan disagreed with. without bothering to work harder and longer to find a consensus position. Now, remember the day that Albanese announced the Voice model? He walked out of his press conference beaming. There were crowds of Labor staffers in the corridor, all applauding him. And you can see he looked so pleased with himself there, and it was baffling because he hadn't succeeded yet, and the model he just announced was never going to succeed. This was all about his own personal legacy. His own personal legacy. He could have delivered Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, which the opposition agreed with and which most Australians agreed with. And he could have legislated a voice instead if he chose, but he insisted on putting the voice in the Constitution, his argument being so that no future government could reverse the decision. Well, if they did, that would be democracy. That's what Ben Fordham told Albanese in one interview on his program. But Albanese chose to proceed this way, and he then refused to give Australians detail about the voice and how it would operate and who would be sitting on it, who its members would be. Jeff Chambers, in his Inside Story piece today, writes that there was a request to give voters more detail about how the voice would operate. Chambers writes, and I quote, "Yes supporters desperate for more details on the voice would win no concessions from the Prime Minister." He writes that Yes and ALP sources say the idea was rejected due to fears that voters would get caught in the weeds like they did ahead of the doomed 1999 Republic referendum. So how does this now impact on Anthony Albanese's leadership and Peter Dutton's? Well, firstly, there's now talk of a Peter Dutton and Jacinta Price ticket at the next election, with a suggestion that Jacinta Price should be leader of the Nationals, replacing David Littleproud. And Bronwyn Bishop even thinks that Price could one day be a Prime Minister. Do you think she could be a future leader of the party?
Undoubtedly. I'd love to see her get to the lower house because she's got what it takes.
To be Prime Minister?
I think so.
But this emphatic result on the weekend doesn't automatically translate into support for Peter Dutton, although it has impacted on public sentiment and confidence in Albanese. It does mean that Australians weren't buying what Albanese was selling. They didn't trust him enough to go along with his vision, and he didn't bring the people with him. All the great Prime Ministers know how to take Australians with them. Now remember, this was Albanese's big vision from the night that he won office.
On behalf of the Australian Labor Party, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
And then here he was on Saturday evening, crestfallen and white as a ghost.
As Prime Minister, I will always accept responsibility for the decisions I've taken, and I do so tonight.
It turns out, despite his own self-belief, Albanese doesn't have that magic touch, that ability to bring the country with him. And it's remarkable when you think of the more difficult and financially painful propositions that John Howard, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating all achieved with the support of the Australian people. Introducing the GST, for example. But Howard took the population with him. Albanese, on the other hand, couldn't with his vision of a voice to Parliament. And the underlying reason that Albanese failed, as I said at the start, is because he's utterly out of touch. He's aligned both with his own electorate, Grayndler, where 74% of these inner city lefty voters supported it. 74% voted yes. And he's aligned with his other place of residence in Canberra, where ACT voted yes. But he can't fathom, in the wake of this defeat, why the rest of Australia didn't agree with him. On Saturday night, when Albanese fronted the media from Canberra to speak after the defeat of the referendum, he tried to blame everyone else. He said it didn't have bipartisan support, and that's code for blaming Peter Dutton. He said that no one serious would have thought the Uluru Statement was 26 pages. Well, that's blaming my colleague Peter Credlin. The only person he didn't truly blame was himself. He didn't take personal responsibility. Instead, he praised his own conviction and he claimed to have restored faith in politics.
I had a duty. As a conviction politician, we argued for this change not out of convenience, but from conviction.
Well, you could argue the opposite is true when he says that he's restored faith in politics, that for the first time in 50 years, Albanese is presiding over a government that is refusing to publish travel records. This is the worst transparency we've seen in half a century. Faith in politics? Well, he wouldn't give the Australian people information about how the voice would work, how people would be appointed. But he expected voters to support it based on goodwill. And Albanese is still forging ahead with misinformation laws that would see individuals fined $8,000 a day if they refuse to show up to a government entity, ACMA, to account for what they've posted online. None of this is restoring faith in politics, far from it. The lesson for our Prime Minister from this referendum is that Australians aren't stupid, they aren't racist. They're smart enough to know when information is being withheld from them, and they won't put up with it. And the Australian newspaper's chief political correspondent, Jeff Chambers, joins me now. Jeff, thank you so much for your time. Look, how does the Prime Minister move on from here? How can he take the country with him when he's so clearly, this result shows he's so clearly out of touch?
Hi, Sharri. Yeah, look, Anthony Albanese absolutely wears this result personally, and it's a real shocking end to that honeymoon, which was longer than a lot of people thought would last. And for the first time, you're sort of really getting a bit of that chatter from really spooked Labor backbenchers and also ministers, because you've got to recall that a lot of cabinet ministers who wrote opinion pieces, delivered speeches, got out there and campaigned with Yes 23, they recorded emphatic no votes on Saturday night. So Anthony Albanese will front up to his caucus room tomorrow to address the troops, try and rally the troops, and really try to show them that he can get back to business and back to those core issues, because every poll from every political party, from every one of the either the yes or the no campaign really showed that it was cost of living issues 1 to 10, and really, particularly in the last couple of weeks, Anthony Albanese was really focused on campaigning. And the irony of it is that the Yes guys actually knew probably at least 3 to 4 weeks ago that this was going to go down. Government people and ALP people also knew that this was going to go down. Now, the scale of it was obviously a lot deeper than they thought. But we've also got this other issue now, Sharri, around Makarrata Commission. Obviously, the No campaign really effectively weaponised treaty and Makarrata. And the government has pledged before the election to implement the Uluru Statement from the heart in full, and treaty and truth-telling are part of those processes. So it will be really interesting, because he's going to come under, once the Indigenous leaders end their week of silence, they're going to come back with a pretty strong response. You've already got the Greens out there, you've got the Teal crossbenchers out there, other Indigenous groups who are going to push really, really hard on this. And then you've got people on the Labor right and others who are in, vulnerable seats who are going to say, look, treaty is toxic out there. You've got the states already doing these things. So I think there's going to have to be real thorough thought around all this.
This, of course, all played out in question time today. So Parliament is sitting in Canberra this week. Opposition leader Peter Dutton questioned whether the Prime Minister was still fit to lead, and he tried to censure Albanese for dividing the nation. He pointed out the $450 million cost in putting this referendum on. Let's have a look at those comments.
Australians are questioning the competence of this Prime Minister, knowing he's clearly not across the detail of decisions which he's making, which adversely affect the lives of Australians. Economic decisions have resulted in prices going up and up. Energy policy is a disaster, with power prices going up and up. The $450 million referendum was against advice and resulted in our country being divided. Will the Prime Minister apologise to the Australian people?
Jeff, I also want to have a look at some comments that both Albanese and Dutton made on Israel today, and I'm going to come back to Israel a bit later in the program. I've got a lot to say about it. But the Prime Minister gave a speech in the House this morning where he pushed for a solution to the Middle East conflict. Have a look.
We believe all people have the right to live in peace within secure borders. The people of Israel have that right. The people of Palestine have that right. And the best path to that reality is a negotiated two-state solution within internationally recognised borders. One of the many tragic consequences of Hamas's abhorrent attack is that it has pushed that two-state solution further out of reach.
Mothers and fathers riddled with bullets, jihadists cheering over the dead bodies of Israeli soldiers, babies being beheaded. Let us be under no misapprehension about Hamas's intent from this point. It has no desire for a peaceful two-state solution. Its actions were just designed to derail the peace process.
Look, Jeff, I mean, Albanese doesn't come to this position naturally. He spent his entire career as a pro-Palestinian advocate, not in Israel's corner. That was a much stronger speech, really, that we saw from Peter Dutton today.
Look, I've been told that, and these are always the two core issues as Labor tries to get back in the game post-Voice. It's around the economy and it's around national security. I thought Anthony Albanese's words today were much stronger than what we saw early last week, and he was obviously out on the Voice campaign trail. So it's no surprise you see Anthony Albanese, Tony Burke, Ed Husick and some of those other Western Sydney MPs who really, we were trying to get some really strong, emphatic quotes last week in relation to what had happened in Israel. And it took until today to actually see them put some more meat on the bones. But for Peter Dutton, you know, this national security space is a comfortable space for him. He knows it inside out. So, Sharri, we've got up to 4 trips over the next month that the Prime Minister will be going to, 2 trips in the US, 1 in Cook Islands, and obviously the trip to Beijing. We've got a lot going on around the world. So I think Anthony Albanese will really have to juggle that strength on national security while also, again, telling households in Australia and business owners that he's got their back and that Labor are back on the job.
Yeah. All right, Jeff Chambers, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next Monday. Now, coming up, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison will join me live. We're going to speak about the Voice result. We're also going to speak about those atrocious Hamas attacks on Israel. That's after this quick break. Well, the terror attacks in Israel were the worst loss of life for the Jewish community since the Holocaust. But today we saw the disgusting spectacle of Greens leader Adam Bandt accusing Israel, not Hamas, Israel, of war crimes. The Albanese government moved a motion condemning the terror group Hamas, and Bandt then moved an amendment to condemn what he called the war crimes perpetuated by the State of Israel. He said in his motion, in his amendment, this includes the bombing of Palestinian civilians. He calls for an immediate ceasefire between all parties and an end to the war on Gaza. War on Gaza. That's what he said. He said he recognises that for there to be peace, there must be an end to the State of Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. I mean, the war on Gaza, is he serious? The war has been on Israel. This terror attack was completely unprovoked. It's brutal and heinous and barbaric. Do I need to repeat it again? Babies killed, babies cut out of their pregnant mothers' stomachs, children taken hostage and separated from their parents, grandparents, the elderly, ripped off their oxygen and medical equipment, 260 young people gunned down as they celebrated at a music festival, young women raped and their dead bodies paraded around like trophies. There is nothing more horrific, and Adam Bandt, the Greens leader, is condemning Israel for war crimes. Shame on him. And do you know who voted with him? The Teal for North Sydney, Kylie Tink. There's so much to talk about on this topic. I don't have enough time. We're about to get to Scott Morrison. Just a few quick points. Firstly, this so-called peaceful Palestinian protest in Sydney still had vile anti-Semitic elements. Ray Hadley and Ben Fordham both played parts of this on air today. Have a listen.
My heart is crying. Allah Akbar. Get the Jews wiped out. How dare, what audacity, what temerity. They are going to say the Gaza.
No, that language is not acceptable.
Man, I don't care. As a Muslim, I have the right to say. Muslims are dying.
The copper comes over after the gentleman very plainly and simply said, please restrict your language. Stop. The copper moves him on. And then the other lunatics allowed to go on for a while. Then the copper says, look, you've got the right to say what you like. No, he doesn't, mate. No, he doesn't. He hasn't got the right to say, wipe the effing Jews out. I mean, I'm not Jewish, but you can't say those things. You can't say it. And yet people keep getting away with it. And the coppers stand idly by.
Look, everyone else in the media has praised this protest. So apparently we're all fine with anti-Semitism now. I'm sorry, but this is disgraceful and these people do not want Jews to exist. This is Sydney, Australia. This is unacceptable. And I'm so glad that people like Ray Hadley have fired up about it because it's not okay. It's not okay. We can't accept this behaviour. We can't praise it and say that it's okay. The other point I want to make tonight is that we're starting to see calls for Israel to be proportionate in its response. Now, you may have seen this brilliant interview already, but here's just a short excerpt of commentator Douglas Murray speaking about what proportionality would actually look like.
Proportionality in conflict rarely exists. But if we were to decide that we should have this fetish about proportionality, then that would mean that in retaliation for what Hamas did in Israel on Saturday, Israel should try to locate a music festival in Gaza, for instance, and good luck with that, should try to find a music festival in Gaza and rape precisely the number of women that Hamas raped on Saturday, kill precisely the number of young people that Hamas killed on Saturday. They should find a town of exactly the same size as a town like Sderot, where I've been many times myself, and make sure they go to door and kill precisely the correct number of babies that Hamas killed in Sderot on Saturday, and shoot in the head precisely the same number of old age pensioners as were shot in Sderot on Saturday, just to choose one town. Proportionality in conflict is a joke.
And look, as the world starts to talk about Israel's response, where are the calls for Egypt to take in Palestinians? And where is the condemnation for Hamas for putting up roadblocks to stop innocent civilians from leaving? Egypt does have a responsibility to step in here, and Hamas needs to be held to account internationally for deliberately stopping Palestinians from leaving when Israel has ordered them to evacuate to protect their own safety. All the condemnation is reserved for Israel, a country that came under unprovoked attack, terrorist attack. The reality is that Israel will be accused and condemned for whatever it does now, however it responds. It has given Palestinian citizens, who are innocent, by the way, 24 hours to evacuate. Israel is trying to save innocent lives, but it's being accused of ethnic cleansing. If it doesn't tell people to leave, it will be accused of killing innocent citizens. The truth is this. Many on the left don't want Israel to respond at all to these terror attacks. They don't want Israel to respond at all. Just let that sink in. Many on the left don't want Israel to defend its people at all from the most barbaric terror attacks we've seen in years. Well, they should be honest about this and say it plainly. Let the terrorists kill Jews. Let the terrorists slaughter your babies and mothers and fathers and the elderly. Don't defend yourselves. Your lives aren't worth it. You aren't worth it. They should say that because that's what they mean. That's the anti-Semitism behind their argument. All right, let's bring in now former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Mr. Morrison, welcome to the program. You are extremely strong in your support of Israel as Prime Minister, and you've shown that support in the past week by visiting synagogues, not for politics, just out of solidarity with Israel and our Jewish community. What's your response, firstly, to the terror attacks in Israel, and also the response that we've seen to it in the streets of Sydney, Australia, with these protests, and in Melbourne?
Well, sure, Sharri. Let's start with the terrible terrorist attacks in Israel first. And as you rightly said, the largest loss of life through the murderous terrorist attacks that we've seen in Israel since the Holocaust itself in a single day. I mean, when you think about that, it's just hard to take that in. And as you try and come to terms with it, and then you start focusing on the barbarity that occurred that you've and others have described in such horrific detail, it's just hard to comprehend it. And what other response can there be to decry it? I mean, we have to be clear that this is a terrorist attack. I said in the Parliament today, to call it even a war adds some sort of legitimacy to Hamas as some sort of combatant. They're not. They are terrorists. Now, in government, we fully listed Hamas as a terrorist organisation, as we did Hezbollah. I made the point in the Parliament today that back in 2018, there was an attempt to pass a motion in the United Nations General Assembly that condemned Hamas for their aggressive and terrorist attacks towards Israel. It lost. Australia certainly voted to decry Hamas. There have been 500 or so motions condemning Israel, but not one in the United Nations that condemned Hamas. The world looked the other way. I mean, the barbarity of Hamas should come as no surprise, and they have inflicted on it in its most awful terror on the innocent civilians. And so there's only one response to that for Israel, and they've been articulating it, and that is to completely remove Hamas from Gaza and to ensure that it has no capability to inflict terror on innocent citizens in Israel. Now, they've been right to try and provide every opportunity, and will continue to, I'm sure, to ensure further innocence. It's not the innocents of Palestine who are the targets of Israel's response. It is Hamas and the terrorists who they are seeking to root out. Now, we've seen, Sharri, a lot of support for Israel this past week, but the real test will be in the weeks ahead. Will we still see that? As Israel takes the steps it should in self-defence to root out Hamas and ensure that it can never do this again? Will they still be supporting? I certainly hope they will. I hope what they're saying today will carry on into the weeks and potentially months ahead. But the reason I reminded everybody of 2018 is I wasn't hearing people say that about Hamas back then. But we certainly were as a government, and always will. It is instinctive. Now, in terms of what's happening here in Australia, well, it's abhorrent. It's abhorrent, and there are laws and rules against that sort of hate speech, and they should be applied. Peter Dutton has made the very good point that people who say these sorts of things, who are here on visas, would never have been given a visa if they'd said those things. That is true.
Do you think
there is room for the Minister for Home Affairs to take action?
Do you think the Minister for Home Affairs should take that action? Do you think people who are here on visas or who are dual citizens should be deported if they are saying anti-Semitic hate speech like "gas the Jews"? If they're here on a visa, then there is absolutely every reason for the Minister for Home Affairs to cancel their visa and to expel them from the country, provided they, the normal tests of evidence and things like that which must apply. But those rules are there for a reason. So, as Ray said, the laws should be enforced. But I think what we also have to ensure is let's not give those with their hate microphone too much amplification. We should decry them and we should deplore them. But let's also reflect on the fact in the past week, the outpouring of support for Israel. Let's reflect on the wonderful strength of the Jewish community that has come together to support each other at a time of just horrific circumstances for them. As I was there at the synagogue on Friday, I was encouraged by the optimism that despite everything that was happening, there they prayed, there they sang, there they read the Torah, there they comforted each other, and were encouraged by the strong support they were getting from so many others.
I pray that will continue. It must continue because Israel, the people of Israel, innocents in Israel, were under a terrorist attack. And that of itself deserves the condemnation that has followed. And let's just hope people stick with it.
Look, I want to move on to The Voice, but just before we do, what's your assessment on how this could escalate if we see the involvement of Iran and the United States?
Well, you make a very good point about Iran. Let's not forget Iran funds Hamas. Iran funds terrorists. They fund them, they train them, and they equip them. Hamas would not have been able to undertake, I believe, these attacks without that support that comes from Iran. And we should be calling on Iran to cease and desist all of that activity. And their very diplomatic relations with Australia and countries like us should be at risk. The US have sent carriers. I'm optimistic that we won't see a broadening of this violence through the actions of other states and potentially of other terrorist groups like Hezbollah. I think and I hope that this will be contained to Israel's response to be able to eradicate Hamas from Gaza. And there needs to be a lot of effort which is placed on, well, what then happens? There needs to be transferred to a credible administration, Palestinian-led, in Gaza. Israel does not wish to occupy in Gaza. I don't believe that's their intention at all. But they can't just let terrorists sit there and lie in wait to strike on Israeli innocents. That's just not an option, and they should be supported to deal with it.
Yeah. Now, look, let's turn to The Voice. This was an emphatic result on Saturday. Every state and territory except for the ACT voting no. Do you think this was the case of Australians rejecting being told what to do by elites in our country?
Yes, I couldn't put it better myself. This was an elitist indulgence by the Prime Minister. And he was absolutely unpersuaded and not engaged in finding any form of consensus on this question that would have secured its success. He believed that it would be carried on the vibe. And I've never seen a lead so big be blown in such a short period of time, as it was clear that the arrogance of this approach to the Australian people, and they rightly rejected it. I must admit, though, I'm pleased that it was defeated for the sake of our Commonwealth and our Constitution. But I do feel for Indigenous Australians, who I think were sold a pup on this, the idea that this was somehow going to completely change their living standards, I think, is a cruel suggestion. And it requires something far more practical than that. And I understand that they would be feeling very disappointed today. But the fault here is having led them to believe that something such as this was what that the Prime Minister was suggesting it could achieve. I think that was folly. The cause of recognition is one that enjoys incredibly broad support in Australia. Our government wished to pursue it, but we knew we couldn't find consensus on a proposal that would achieve broad-based support. The Labor Party never offered us bipartisan support for a recognition model. Their condition was always that it must be the voice or nothing. So any suggestion that somehow there was bipartisan support while we were in government for a recognition referendum that didn't include the voice, that is complete falsehood.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that.
Mr Albanese insisted on the voice the whole way.
So you went to Albanese and said, will you offer bipartisan support if we have Indigenous recognition in the Constitution? And I just want to clarify this. And he said no, unless it had the voice with it. Is that right?
The Labor Party was clear all along through our term, because we were seeking to find this, and Minister White was seeking to find it, and he came to me and said, well, we don't have consensus for a wording that would deal with recognition. You know, the Labor Party's position has always been voice or nothing. And so as a result, by insisting on the voice being the instrument for recognition, we weren't able to put forward a referendum in the last term, and now he has put this forward in this term, which has failed, and I fear has set that cause back some many years, and I think that's very sad. And so by the belligerent insistence on that proposal has led, I think, to us going backwards, not forwards, and I think that's very very unfortunate for Australia as a whole, because this referendum was rejected on the basis that Australians wanted us to be united, not two separate countries. And so the idea that we would now entertain treaties and things of that nature, I think, is just absurd.
Mr. Morrison, I just want to ask you about what the yes vote in the teal seats means for the coalition going forward, because clearly it shows that in areas where the Liberal Party wanted to win back these teal seats at the next election, their constituency was voting against what Peter Dutton was putting forward. So how does the Liberal Party possibly win these seats back?
Well, I think that the level of support was much less than we'd seen in some of these seats for referendums in the past. And I think I think that only highlights, why the yes vote was as low as it was, even in those seats, even though they were successful in many of those seats. But that said, I think there has been, a shift in those seats now going over some time. We saw that at the last election. I think that was present in the 2019 election. But in the 2019 election, when we were successful, the issues of people paying higher taxes on everything from their superannuation to their properties was something that was rejected strongly in those electorates, and we were successful. So, look, I think it does present challenges for us in those places, but I applaud the work that people like Paul Fletcher did. And Gillian Leese is a person of great integrity on many issues, and on this one he's always been consistent. So, look, I think obviously we need to keep engaging with those places and those electorates, and our core credentials where they've traditionally supported us, particularly on our management of the economy and our management of national security, I think speaks volumes and is supported in those places. But where other issues become more dominant, as they did at the 22 election, and when they're put in single issue form like we saw on the weekend, well, I'm not surprised that they have responded in the way they have. But you mentioned before Kylie Tink.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And her position on the Greens motion today is flabbergasting. Absolutely flabbergasting. Nothing more I could really say other than that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, I really appreciate you coming on the program tonight. Thank you so much for your time. Coming up, Joe Hildebrand and Andrew Carswell on whether Anthony Albanese can still lead this polarised country and how he brings it together. Stay tuned. Here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. Israel is preparing to launch a monumental ground assault on Hamas as Joe Biden calls the attacks as consequential as the Holocaust. The opposition leader is trying to move a motion to condemn the Prime Minister for wasting millions of dollars of taxpayer money on a referendum that has divided Australia. The ABC will be forced to pay former Commando Heston Russell nearly $400,000 after he won his defamation suit against the broadcaster. New Zealand's new Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, says he's not ruling out a referendum on the country's founding document, despite warnings it could cause civil disobedience. And emergency fires have been declared in New South Wales as authorities battle to control 75 blazes across the state. All right, let's bring in tonight's panel. Joining me in Sydney, Joe Hildebrand. Great to see you.
Lovely to see you, Sharri.
And in Canberra, Andrew Carswell. Well, let's start with The Voice. Joe, look, you've been a big defender of The Voice.
Yep.
What went wrong here, and can Albanese still lead the country, or is his position now ultimately untenable?
Well, I don't think we have long enough on this show to go through what went wrong. Pretty much everything went wrong for the campaign. Calling Australians racist was wrong. Not having simple answers for questions like, what does this mean for treaty, was wrong. Making it look like the same old renter crowd. I mean, the faces I saw supporting this, going for a walk around Redfern in support of The Voice. I mean, if 250,000 people walking across the Harbour Bridge didn't get an apology from the Howard government, what on earth do they think that a handful of protests would get, or a handful of marches in solidarity or whatever they would get for The Voice? I think they were delusional about how it could be turned around. They thought that all the undecided voters that they'd somehow managed to marginalise would miraculously come back to them if they just kept doing the same old stuff. The rally, the campaign I saw, and you can see I'm pretty frustrated. I've been saying a lot of this stuff privately to various figures, but I've been warning that this was heading off a cliff for months and months and months and months, and that it needed something very, very big, a full reboot, a full reset. That didn't happen. The same old people kept saying the same old things, and we saw the ridiculous notion that Australians were racist, so they wouldn't support it. We saw people talking about it as though it was something not practical and positive for the future, but rather this is something that we owed Indigenous people because of all the mistreatment of generations past. That resonates really badly with migrant Australians, especially new Australians, and that's why we saw a whole bunch of rich white people supporting the Voice, and in southwestern and western Sydney and other migrant communities, a whole bunch of people rejecting it 2-1. Tell me how that's a good campaign.
Andrew Carswell, I mean, it's not really a surprise. You accuse people of being racist, you call them chicken littles, accuse them of misinformation. What could turn them off?
Yeah, massive mismanagement by the PM in this regards, and it comes down to a lack of clarity and stubbornness from his part as well. I mean, if you were passionate about seeing the Voice set up in Australia and giving advice to Parliament, if you hung your prime ministership on this very issue, wouldn't you sit down and seek bipartisanship from the start of that process? Not anywhere through the process did he seek to do that. And he admitted on Saturday night, this is the Prime Minister, admitted that no referendum had been successful in Australia without the support of the opposition party. So knowing that was going to be the outcome, he still set off on that boat to achieve what he set out to achieve. And that is just total stubbornness from my point of view.
Joe, I want to talk about these pro-Palestinian rallies that we've seen in Melbourne and in Sydney. Look, a lot of people praising them in the past 24 hours for saying, they were peaceful, but there's still a lot of anti-Semitism there. And how is that acceptable?
I just do not know why, even from just a purely cold-blooded, pragmatic perspective, you would decide that the day after or the week after a terrorist organisation kidnaps women and children, beheads babies, slaughters innocents in the worst attack on Israel probably since its creation, and then this is the time to get on that bandwagon. This is the time to fly the flag for the cause that they are killing, murdering innocent women and children in the name of. That's just politically stupid and morally repugnant.
Callous.
Just for an addition. So again, I support people's right to protest, but why you would hitch your wagon to that train, I don't know. And also, calling for Jews to be killed is not a legitimate form of protesting. That is not free speech. The radical left hates free speech when anyone else utilises it, but they seem to think, it's okay or it's not a big deal if people come to our rallies and say, kill all Jews. Imagine if it was a neo-Nazi saying it, or imagine if it was someone saying, kill all Muslims. People would be taken up and rounded up and put out the back and shot. And yet when this happens, they were mostly peaceful.
Not shot,
Give me a break.
deported or charged.
No, I mean in the
just be careful with our language here, Joe.
I mean in the radical communist Russian Revolution thing, which the left, of course, support, which is what actually happened to anyone who deviated from the party line. But it is just absolutely despicable behaviour, and I cannot believe it's even remotely being defended.
Andrew Carswell, what do you think about the Greens leader Adam Bant today not condemning Hamas, the terrorists, condemning Israel?
Well, and the member for North Sydney, which is quite galling. But look, there can be no equivocation here. If you're not condemning Hamas and Hamas's supporters for the slaughter of innocent men, women, children and babies, if you're not calling that out and condemning that, then you are not just merely pro-Palestinian. You are fundamentally anti-Israeli. And we have to call a spade here. And for too long, when it comes to these issues, you have many people that seek to hide their anti-Semitism behind what is effectively a popular left-wing social cause.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more. Look, I'm sorry, this is so short this week, guys. I went over with my interview with Scott Morrison. Joe Hildebrand, thank you so much for your strong comments. Andrew Carswell, thank you so much. After the break, the Australian's Yoni Bashan gives us the latest from Israel as it prepares the dangerous mission of going into Gaza to try to bring back the hostages. That's after this break. Welcome back. Well, as Israel prepares its ground invasion, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is vowing to tear Hamas apart.
ראיתי את הלוחמים הנפלאים שלנו. I saw our wonderful fighters who are now on the front line. They know that the whole nation is behind them. They understand the magnitude of the task. They are ready to snap into action at any moment in order to wipe out the bloodthirsty monsters who seek to annihilate us. If Hamas thought we would fall apart, then no, we will tear Hamas apart.
Joining me now live from Israel is Yoni Bashan from The Australian. Thank you so much for joining us. Most people are flying out of the war zone. You're flying into it. Yoni, what's the latest with Israel's preparation to launch this ground invasion of Gaza to try and retrieve the hostages?
Well, I think right now we have a bit of a waiting game going on where we are almost certain that there's going to be a ground invasion into Gaza. It's just yet to actually formally take place. So what we're seeing at the moment is a buildup of ground troops, tanks, and other personnel closer to the border with Gaza, and they're on standby waiting to go in. And then there are skirmishes occurring up north along the border with Lebanon, where overnight we've had anti-tank missiles fired into Israel, into an area called Shtula, and approximately 5 people have been injured in those attacks. Obviously, there's been an IDF response. But basically, you've got a country in a state of very high alert because you've got a potential front opening up in the north. You've obviously got actions that are going to need to take place in the south. You've got military leaders and politicians who are talking about a when, not if, they're going to go in. And yet we're all kind of waiting for the inevitable to happen. It just hasn't happened yet.
Mm. And what's the mood like on the ground in Israel? Others I've spoken to have said it's kind of like lockdown, where no one's on the streets and people are just hiding in their shelters. Is that the sense that you're getting?
I think that's pretty accurate, as a matter of fact. I went into Tel Aviv last night, and I've been into Tel Aviv a couple of times, and there's very much a somber atmosphere. I would almost describe it as an unofficial state of mourning, in fact. If you go to anyone's house or if you speak to anyone on the street, there's really no other topic of conversation to talk about apart from what happened over the weekend. Restaurants are closed, cafes are closed. I mean, we're in a country famous for hummus. Pretty hard to find a hummus at the moment. That's a minor complaint, but it's a real one. There's a general atmosphere here of sadness. And as I said, people only want to talk about the one thing. And the second thing they want to talk about is what the government is going to do in response. And I suppose if there's a third tranche to that conversation, it's what are the consequences of that? So there's a high state of anxiety about what the future is going to look like, not just for Israel, but for the Middle East as a whole.
Mm. Look, we've only got a minute left. You've written some quite incredible reports for The Australian on just the brutality of those terror attacks. Tell me about some of the stories and the people you spoke to.
Absolutely horrendous things that have been written about. And obviously, because of the graphic nature of what occurred over the weekend, it's actually very hard to put some of it into print. We've all seen the videos that are circulating on social media. And there's a great debate that's happening everywhere right now, not just with media organisations, but with commentators as to what level of information should actually be publicised. Because on the one hand, it's difficult information and difficult footage to absorb. On the other hand, the level of evil that was perpetrated over the weekend must be seen. So that's a conversation taking place. And just on the reporting I've done, I've heard heartwarming stories of how the country has banded together. I've just finished writing a story about an animal shelter that's going in with the army to rescue the pets that were left behind in the massacre sites. And on the other hand, I've spoken to people who've lost loved ones and relatives.
And Yoni,
and so those are...
I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're out of time. We will cross back to you again this week when that ground invasion starts. That's all we've got time for tonight. I'll be here tomorrow at 5 o'clock. The Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem will join me and Ben Fordham. Here's Peter Credlin.